Raw's ratings are as low as they've ever been. Wrestlers are being released every few weeks, the writers don't know what they're doing, and the fans aren't happy, but I think I have the answer to all of their problems, right? 34. I feel like this is the answer because 34 is the age that every wrestler should be. Because if you're under the age of 34, right, you're a baby, you're inexperienced, you've no idea how to operate at the highest level. But if you're over 34, granny, granddad. You can try wrestle over the age of 34, but your arms will probably fall off because you're very old and wrinkly. So upon reaching this well thought out conclusion, I also decided to carve out our very own road to SummerSlam using only 34-year-olds. I would say, you know, if you disagree with any of this fancy booking or you have any better ideas, do let me know. But I think we'll all agree come the end of this video that this is actually fantasy booking perfection. So, let's get started then. Alright, so we start with the first week of Monday Night Raw. And who comes out? Only none other than the new authority figure, 34-year-old Pat McAfee. He shows up and he announces to the crowd that they have fired anybody under the age of 34 or over the age of 34, and anyone in the crowd that's over or under the age of 34 must leave immediately. And this goes down really well with all the 34-year-olds in the crowd. They're like, yeah, and they're chanting, you know, 34, 34. It's a really good announcement. Everyone's happy. But our only pay-per-view between now and SummerSlam is Money in the Bank. So we need to decide who goes to Money in the Bank, and we'll do that with a really exciting main event I'll get to in a minute. But throughout the night, we have interviews with different wrestlers who are in that main event. 3 at a time. So we start with the first 3. Kyle O'Reilly shows up and he says, I'm going to win the main event tonight and I'm going to Money in the Bank. And then Xavier Woods shows up and he says, I'm going to win the main event. And then Jinder Mahal shows up and he says, as a 34-year-old man, I'm going to win this main event and I'm going to Money in the Bank. Then we see the return of none other than 34-year-old Becky Lynch. The crowd are going crazy. Everyone's happy. She goes to make an announcement when all of a sudden the lights go out. And they come back on, and it's The Fiend. And Becky Lynch just says, this is really fucking embarrassing. I am actually so embarrassed to be involved in one of these segments. Could you just tone it fucking down, please? We cut backstage, and we have 3 more interviews. Tyler Rust shows up, and he says, I'm gonna win the main event tonight. T-Bar shows up, and he says, I'm gonna win the main event tonight. Then Joaquin Wilde shows up, and he says, I'm gonna win the main event tonight. And then we cut to our first match of the evening. It's Kalisto versus Mojo Rawley. Yes, I'm bringing them back. I know they've been released, but they are both 34 years old. The roster is a bit thin at the minute, so we're going to have them scrap with each other. It's an excellent match, and in the end, Mojo Rawley spears Kalisto out of his boots and gets the win. We cut backstage again for the final 3 interviews. Drew Gulak shows up and he says, I'm going to win the main event. Lindsay Dorado shows up and he says the exact same thing. And then finally Joseph Connor shows up and he says, I am going to Money in the Bank. Finally, it's the main event that I've been alluding to for the last minute or so. There are 8 spots in the Money in the Bank ladder match. There are 9 participants in tonight's 9-man Royal Rumble. The final 8 get to go to Money in the Bank. So Joseph Connors gets eliminated and the remaining 8 men go to Money in the Bank. It's set. Then we proceed to SmackDown, and SmackDown opens up with 3 letters appearing on the Titantron. AEW. Because the key to a good event like this, and a good road to SummerSlam, is the forbidden door being wide open, and 34-year-olds from every single company all coming in to compete. So who shows up? Only AEW's 34-year-olds, Pac, Cash Wheeler, Trent, and Angelico. And they come out and Pac says, we're AEW and we're invading. The awkward part of this is that I've put everyone on Raw from WWE just because, again, we don't really have the numbers for a brand split. So they're actually on their own on SmackDown. So they end up having Cash Wheeler versus Trent for the first hour of SmackDown, and then Angelico versus Pac for the second hour of SmackDown. And that's actually the end of SmackDown. Nobody's in WWE is actually aware that they've taken over because they've all been focused on Raw the entire time. We start off the second week of Raw with Becky Lynch versus The Fiend after the match was set up last week. And after an hour of Becky Lynch absolutely destroying him, she gets the win. After the match, she grabs the microphone and she says, look, I am the only woman in all of WWE who's 34 years of age, so I'm going to climb this ladder right now and call myself Mrs. Money in the Bank because there's no competition, so I win by default. But just as she's climbing up the ladder is getting tipped over. Out of nowhere, somebody is tipping over the ladder. She falls off, and who tips over the ladder? It's Kelly Kelly. Then we cut to a contract signing for the men's Money in the Bank match. All 8 of them gathered around the table, all signing the contract. It's nice and civil until Lindsay Dorado says, "There's no ink left in my pen." And there's a bit of tension there, a little bit of quiet tension, when Jinder Mahal says, "I've got a spare pen here, you can use this." And the pen works. They all sign the contract. We're good to go for Money in the Bank. And that's the end of the segment, because there really is a market, I genuinely feel, for peaceful, nice contract signings, and that's what we're going to do this week on Raw. Then we have Kalisto versus Mojo Rawley in a rematch, because the first match is really, really good. The second match is just as good, but this time Kalisto gets the win. Then we go to the final segment. The AEW invaders show up and they say, "We are taking SmackDown. SmackDown is ours, and there is nothing any of you can do about it." WWE then cancels SmackDown just because it'd be really funny, and they've got no show then to take over for themselves. But then it's time for Money in the Bank. And we open with the trilogy. Kalisto versus Mojo Rawley. It goes right down to the wire, but Mojo Rawley gets the win in the end, and afterwards, there's a handshake between the two, a mutual sign of respect after the battles they've just had. This is followed by Joseph Connors taking on the returning Alexander Wolf. Alexander Wolf gets the win. Then it's time for the singles match we've all been waiting for, Becky Lynch versus Kelly Kelly, but it goes to a no contest because somebody shows up, beats the shit out of both of them, and that somebody is 34-year-old Lacey Von Erich. Then it's time for the main event, the men's Money in the Bank ladder match, and the winner is Joaquin Wilde, just as everyone expected. On the first Raw after Money in the Bank, Team AEW come out and they say, "Haha, very funny, you cancelled SmackDown. Well, do you know what? You get your 4 best men, we have our 4 best men. Winner takes over Raw." Then we have a triple threat. It's Becky Lynch versus Kelly Kelly versus Lacey Von Erich, and the winner is nobody. It is again a no contest because of interference, and the person who interferes this time, it's 34-year-old Caitlyn. Then Tyler Rust and T-Bar come out and they say, "We are the best tag team in this company. We're also the worst tag team in this company. We're the only tag team in this company. So, for that reason, we should be the tag team champions." But out of nowhere, they get interrupted by the new tag team of Kalisto and Mojo Rawley, and they say, "Well, if you want the tag belts, we'll scrap for them next week." Then Team AEW comes out and they're like, "Right, who's coming to fight us for your company?" And Xavier Woods shows up, Kyle O'Reilly shows up, Drew Gulak shows up, and Bray Wyatt shows up. They beat Team AEW, they send Team AEW packing. It's a happy ending for Team WWE, but after all the wrestlers leave and you think it's the end of the show, one more person shows up, and it's Nick Aldis. And he says, "Look, you've got no champions here because you fired everyone who wasn't 34 and there was no 34-year-old champions. I'm 34, I'm the NWA champion, so that makes me the WWE World's Champion." But as he's speaking, he just gets fucking clattered by Joaquin Wilde with the fucking briefcase. Just fucking batters him. He cashes in, gets the NWA Championship, and the world title now belongs to Legado del Fantasma. But as Wilde is celebrating, who comes out? Jinder Mahal. And he says, "Look, I'm a former world champion myself. I'm bigger than you, I'm stronger than you, I'm better than you. Fight me next week." And Joaquin Wilde says, "Yeah, no bother." So week 4, we start off with a fatal 4-way. So everyone that fought for Team WWE last week are rewarded with a number 1 contender's fatal 4-way. And the winner is Bray Wyatt. Tyler Rust and T-Bar team up to take on Mojo and Kalisto for the tag titles. Tyler Rust and T-Bar win. Then we get a fatal 4-way. Becky Lynch versus Kelly Kelly versus Lacey Von Erich versus Caitlyn. And the winner is Becky Lynch, and she literally rips Caitlyn's arms like clean off. And it freaks everyone out, but it's like Lucha Underground, like she cinematically kills her off. And then we get to the main event, Joaquin Wilde versus Jinder Mahal for the NWA World title. However, as Jinder Mahal is making his entrance, he disappears into a cloud of smoke, never to be seen ever again, because it's his birthday and he turns 35 and we can't be fucking having that. So Joaquin Wilde is in the ring waiting for his opponent. He doesn't know what to do, and all of a sudden the number 1 contender who won the match at the start of the show, Bray Wyatt, shows up. None of this Fiend bullshit either. This is proper Bray Wyatt. He shows up, beats Joaquin Wilde, and we have a new NWA champion. Week 5. We open the show with Lacey Von Erich versus Kelly Kelly in a one-on-one barbed wire inferno match. I just like to spice things up. There's not enough barbed wire inferno matches on Raw at the minute, and I feel like this would probably gauge people's interests. They both push each other into the fire and kill each other off, kind of like Lucha Underground. And then we have a tag team match. It is a number one contenders match. Kyle O'Reilly and Drew Gulak against Xavier Woods and Alexander Wolf. These may seem like thrown together teams, but when you think about it, Xavier Woods and Alexander Wolf both have W in their names, so they're really destined to have great chemistry. But the winners are Kyle O'Reilly and Drew Gulak. They're going on to take on Tyler Rust and T-Bar next week. Then Becky Lynch comes out and she says, look, I've ripped off Caitlin's arms. Lacey Von Erich and Kelly Kelly have killed each other off. Again, I am the only woman in the division who's 34 years of age. I am now going to call myself Mrs. Money in the Bank. But who interrupts her this time? None other than 34-year-old AJ Lee. But now it's time for the main event, and the main event is a rematch. It's Bray Wyatt versus Joaquin Wilde for the NWA World Championship. Only this time, the ending isn't as conclusive, because just when you think Joaquin Wilde is fighting back and might win his title back, you just hear music. You hear "In this world I'll find a way to cross the line." You hear "Cross the Line," TNA's theme song from 2008 that they haven't used in years. It's no longer relevant, but it's their best ever theme song, so they're going to use it. And all of a sudden, there's Team Impact in the ring, all their 34-year-olds. They beat the absolute shit out of Joaquin Wilde. They kill him off, kind of like Lucha Underground, and they stare down Bray Wyatt, eyeing up his NWA World Championship. And this leads us nicely into Week 6. Week 6 opens with a shot in the car park of Xavier Woods and Alexander Wolf. They've been killed off by Willie Mack, kind of like Lucha Underground. Becky Lynch then takes on AJ Lee, but the entire match is ruined because of interference from Impact's Alicia Edwards. Then we get a tag title match. Kyle O'Reilly and Drew Gulak take on Tyler Rust and T-Bar, and Kyle O'Reilly and Gulak get the win. But after the match, their celebrations don't last long, because out comes Impact's Big Cass and Steve Cutler, and they challenge Kyle O'Reilly and Gulak for the belts next week on Raw. But in the main event, it's an NWA World title match. Josh Alexander versus Bray Wyatt. And Josh Alexander kills Bray Wyatt. He absolutely wipes the floor with him and murders him. Kind of like Lucha Underground, because Josh Alexander is an absolute fucking tank and I love him. So I feel like if we are opening the forbidden door, the man should be Josh Alexander right now. But this leads us into Week 7, and in Week 7 we see a shot of the car park, and we see on the ground dead Tyler Rust and T-Bar. They have been murdered by Willie Mack, kind of like Lucha Underground. Kyle O'Reilly and Drew Gulak take on Big Cass and Steve Cutler in a tag title match, and the winners are Big Cass and Steve Cutler. They murder Kyle O'Reilly and Drew Gulak, kind of like Lucha Underground. Then Becky Lynch and AJ Lee take on Alicia Edwards in a 2-on-1 handicap match. And is there an upset? Absolutely not. Becky Lynch and AJ Lee fucking destroy Alicia Edwards. They murder her, kind of like Lucha Underground. Then it's time for the main event. Josh Alexander's open challenge. He feels like he can take on anyone and everyone from WWE, from any company, as long as they are 34 years old. We cut to the Titantron and there is a time ticking down, like a timer, and there's shots of a calendar, and then Josh Alexander's in the ring and he's quite confident because he knows the roster, he's seen what everyone's capable of, and he's not overly impressed. But the calendar then shows that it's the 20th of August 2021, and do you know whose 34th birthday is on the 20th of August 2021? First of all, holy fucking shit what a match this would be, but here's what happens anyway. Walter chops Josh Alexander in a way that only Walter can chop someone. It reverberates and echoes around the entire arena, and then out of nowhere, Josh Alexander just starts floating away. He floats sort of up slowly out of the arena, then kind of up through the sky, then out of the planet and into space. That's the end of Week 7. Week 8, we're ready for a whole show full of surprises with Team Impact taking on Team WWE, but instead what we have is Big Cass, Steve Cutler and Willie Mack, and they're all standing around and they just say, look, Josh Alexander has disappeared and Alicia Edwards has been murdered. We're quite scared of Walter. We surrender. We're happy to go back to Impact and do our thing. Nice knowing yous. Goodbye. So this leaves us with a very depleted go-home show for SummerSlam, but I think it adds to the drama. The main event is Becky Lynch versus AJ Lee. We finally get the match we all want to see. Becky Lynch gets the win, and after the match she turns around and she says, I want a big match for SummerSlam. I want the main event of SummerSlam and I want Walter. We are in for a stacked night of action. We open up the show with Lindsay Dorado versus Joseph Connors, and you may think that that's because they're the only two wrestlers on the roster who haven't been killed off yet. That's actually true. Then it's time for the main event. Becky Lynch versus Walter, all the gold on the line. Walter starts by chopping Becky Lynch, and she gets kind of cut in half. Kind of like Lucha Underground. That never happened on Lucha Underground. Anyway, that's the end of the story.